Right, here we are in chapter 41 of North and South. Okay, so in this chapter, I just wanted to point out here Frederick writes Margaret a pretty vehement letter, so an emphatic letter, containing his renunciation of England as his country. He wished he could unnative himself and declared that he would not take his pardon if it were offered to him, nor live in the country if he had permission to do so. So a lot of that is just him sort of feeling unhappy that he's not allowed to come back to England. But also we see again that parallel between Frederick and Margaret, that Frederick, through sort of the consequences of his upheaval, is moving far away from his country of origin, his religion of origin, settling in Spain and becoming Catholic. And Margaret does similarly. She stays in England, but she moves from the south to the north. She changes all her opinions about manufacturers, and she kind of moves away from the values of her class. And you'll see that in the footnote that's in your books. It mentions that as well. Okay, more on Frederick here. We see Frederick's worldly position was raised by this marriage onto as high a level as they could desire. So he's getting married to a lovely Spanish girl, Dolores. Barber & Co. was one of the most extensive Spanish houses, and into it he was received as a junior partner. Margaret smiled a little and then sighed as she remembered afresh her old tirades against trade. Here was her pro-chevalier of a brother turned merchant, trader. Okay, pro-chevalier meaning true knight. So her gentlemanly brother turned merchant, trader. So there again we see that she's beginning to have new ideas about trade, that she's beginning to accept that social hierarchy is changing. But then she rebelled against herself and protested silently against the confusion implied between a Spanish merchant and a Milton mill owner. So she still got a little bit of that class distinction remaining in her head. Okay, Mr. Hale goes off with Mr. Bell for a trip to Oxford, I think. When her father had driven off on his way to the railroad, Margaret felt how great and long had been the pressure on her time and her spirits. It was astonishing, almost stunning, to feel herself so much at liberty. So we see there again this notion of Margaret feeling crushed by her obligations as a woman. So she does, Gaskell does bring this up, and I think that she is kind of registering some sort of small protest against the kind of emotional labour that is expected of women at this time. Okay, coming through. Oh, that's all for that chapter. Okay, chapter 42. Okay, so this is Mr. Thornton speaking here to Mr. Bell, and he's talking to Mr. Bell about Higgins and how he's become acquainted with Higgins, and that he's put some of his children in school. So they've developed this relationship, Thornton and Higgins, where they kind of look upon each other as acquaintances. They get to know each other, and Mr. Thornton is helping out by putting some of Higgins's kind of foster children, Boucher's children, to school. And then we see that Mr. Thornton had this idea here about having a sort of communal kitchen for the factory, for his factory. But it was not till provisions grew so high this winter. Okay, so the prices of the ingredients grew so high this winter that I bethought me how by buying things wholesale and cooking a good quantity of provisions together, much money might be saved and much comfort gained. So this is a kind of new arrangement for Mr. Thornton, the hard Mr. Thornton with no compassion. Suddenly because he's got this acquaintanceship with Higgins and he sees the kind of horrible dinner that he eats, frizzle of a dinner, a greasy cinder of meat, he thinks, oh, we could do this thing where we just buy things wholesale and cook them up and everyone can have a good meal and, we could save some money and whatnot. So he's suddenly starting to think of the welfare of his workers through this acquaintanceship. And Gaskell really pushes that attitude, that idea that once you know an individual, you're no longer at war with the whole class. You open up your emotions and your heart and your empathy to everyone because you know one. So he tells Higgins the plan. Higgins objects, but then Higgins comes back with the same scheme and says it's his idea. So Thornton says, yep, okay, let's do that. And Thornton says, he was very scrupulous at first in confining myself to the mere purchasing part. So he's letting them have their independence and he doesn't want to trespass upon their independence. I think they saw how careful I was to leave them free and not to intrude my own ideas upon them. So one day, 2 or 3 of the men, my friend Higgins, notice that, friend Higgins, among them, asked me if I would not come in and take a snack. It was a very busy day, but I saw that the men would be hurt if, after making the advance, I didn't meet them halfway. So again, this sense of friendship, of compromise, of having a relationship, meeting people halfway. So I went in and I never made a better dinner in my life. So he really enjoyed the dinner that he'd had. And then, they invited him in whenever that same dinner was on, hot pot for dinner today, when you come. Okay, and we see that he's beginning to have a different sort of relationship with his workers. It's not just, as Thornton calls it later, the cash nexus, I pay you, you work for me, but rather a relationship between men where there's civility and friendship of a sort, not close friends, but some form of friendship between them. And he says to Mr. Bell, I expect you will pay my experiment the respect of silence. So he says, don't go talking about my experiment. His experiment there is the dinner scheme. It is but a new broom at present and sweeps clean enough. So he's saying, well, it's working pretty well at the moment, but by and by we shall meet with plenty of stumbling blocks, no doubt. But we see a change in Thornton. We see that empathy and that care for the welfare of his workers that seems to show the impact of Margaret upon him, as well as Higgins, because Margaret encouraged this relationship with Higgins, and now he has this relationship with Higgins, and it is changing what sort of employer he is. Okay, and we'll just leave that little recording there, and I'll go on to a new one. Now, of course, I have to find the way to stop it. Haha, okay.